The afternoon sun cast different shadows through the library windows as James returned to the scene of the morning's crisis, this time accompanied by Princess Charlotte and her governess, Miss Andrews. Charlotte had specifically requested this meeting, wanting to speak with James in the place where he had protected her, and palace officials had agreed that facing the location of her trauma in a controlled, supportive environment might help her process the experience. Charlotte appeared remarkably composed as she entered the library, though James noticed she stayed close to Miss Andrews and glanced briefly at the spot where David Morrison had held her captive. She was dressed in casual clothes now rather than her school uniform, and someone had braided her hair with small blue ribbons that matched her cardigan, small touches that reminded James how young she truly was. "Hello, Sergeant Mitchell," she said formally, offering him a small curtsy that made him smile despite the gravity of their situation. "Thank you for agreeing to speak with me." "It's my honor, Your Royal Highness," James replied, bowing slightly. "How are you feeling this afternoon?" "Better," Charlotte answered honestly. Dr. Henderson explained that it's normal to feel scared after something frightening happens, but that talking about it can help. "Miss Andrews and I have been discussing what happened, and I wanted to ask you some questions, if that's all right." James exchanged a glance with Miss Andrews, who nodded encouragingly. He could see the careful balance the governess was trying to maintain, supporting Charlotte's need to understand her experience while protecting her from details that might be too disturbing for a 9-year-old to process. "Of course," James said, settling into one of the library chairs while Charlotte chose a seat across from him. "You can ask me anything you'd like." Was that the immediate aftermath of the library incident unfolded with the precision of a well-rehearsed emergency protocol, though James could sense the underlying tension that came with such a serious breach of royal security. Within minutes of David's arrest, the palace was swarming with additional security personnel, medical staff, and senior officials who needed to understand exactly how an unstable former employee had managed to gain access to Princess Charlotte. James remained with Charlotte while Dr. Sarah Henderson, the palace's chief medical officer, conducted a thorough examination to ensure she hadn't been harmed during her ordeal. The princess sat quietly on an antique chair in the library, answering the doctor's questions with remarkable composure while James stood nearby, still processing the adrenaline that continued to course through his system. "Sergeant Mitchell," Dr. Henderson said after completing her examination, "Princess Charlotte appears to be physically unharmed, though she may experience some delayed emotional reactions to the trauma. I recommend she rest for the remainder of the day and that someone speaks with her about what happened in age-appropriate terms." James nodded, grateful that Charlotte had escaped physical injury, but deeply concerned about the psychological impact of the incident. He had seen how traumatic encounters could affect children long after the immediate danger had passed, and he knew that Charlotte would need careful support in the coming weeks and months. Commander Patricia Walsh, the head of Royal Security, arrived at the library just as Dr. Henderson was finishing her examination. James had worked under Commander Walsh for 6 years and had tremendous respect for her tactical expertise and unwavering dedication to the royal family's safety. However, he also knew that she would be under intense pressure from palace officials to explain how this security breach had occurred. "Sergeant Mitchell," Commander Walsh said briskly, "I need a complete debriefing immediately. Princess Charlotte, are you feeling well enough to speak with your governess? She's quite worried about you." "Yes, ma'am," Charlotte replied politely. "May I see Sergeant Mitchell again later? I want to thank him properly for helping me." James felt a warmth spread through his chest at her thoughtful request, and he could see that Commander Walsh was impressed by the princess's grace under pressure. "Of course, Your Royal Highness," the commander replied. "Sergeant Mitchell will be available whenever you'd like to speak with him." As Charlotte was escorted from the library by her governess and additional security personnel, James found himself alone with Commander Walsh for the first time since the incident began. He knew that the next few hours would determine not only his immediate future with the Royal Guard, but potentially his entire career in security service. "Walk me through everything," Commander Walsh said, settling into one of the library's leather chairs and pulling out a digital recorder. "From the moment you first heard Princess Charlotte's voice until my team secured the suspect. I need every detail, no matter how minor it might seem." James began his account with the routine moments of his morning shift, describing the quiet normalcy that had been shattered by Charlotte's scream. He detailed his immediate response, his tactical assessment of the situation, and the split-second decision-making that had guided his actions throughout the confrontation. As he spoke, James found himself reliving the intense moments when Charlotte's safety had hung in the balance, when David Morrison's unpredictable behavior could have turned a frightening situation into an absolute tragedy. He described the negotiation process, his attempts to build rapport with an unstable individual, and the careful balance he had tried to maintain between protecting Charlotte and avoiding an escalation that might have ended in violence. "You abandoned your assigned post without authorization," Commander Walsh observed when James had finished his initial account. "Protocol requires that you radio for backup and maintain your position until relieved or specifically ordered to respond to an emergency." James had expected this criticism and had prepared his response during the moments when he wasn't actively focused on Charlotte's welfare. "Ma'am, I made a tactical decision based on the immediate threat assessment. Princess Charlotte's distress call indicated an emergency in progress, and my position gave me the best opportunity to respond quickly. Waiting for backup authorization would have cost precious seconds that could have determined the outcome." Commander Walsh nodded thoughtfully, and James could see her mentally weighing his explanation against the rigid protocols that governed royal security operations. "Tell me about your interaction with Morrison. Had you encountered him before during his employment here?" "I had no direct memory of Morrison from his time as a maintenance worker," James admitted. "However, during the negotiation, I recalled fragments of security briefings about a former employee who had made concerning statements about palace vulnerabilities. I used that information to establish a connection with him and de-escalate the situation." "That was quick thinking," Commander Walsh acknowledged. "Morrison's personnel file indicates a history of mental health issues and increasing paranoia about security threats. He was terminated 3 months ago after submitting numerous reports claiming that the palace was vulnerable to infiltration. His access credentials were supposed to have been completely revoked." James felt a chill as he realized the implications of what Commander Walsh had just revealed. "Ma'am, if his credentials were revoked, how did he gain access to the palace this morning? And, more specifically, how did he reach the family quarters without being detected by perimeter security?" "That's exactly what we're trying to determine," Commander Walsh replied grimly. "Preliminary investigation suggests that Morrison may have used knowledge gained during his employment to exploit a gap in our security coverage. He appears to have entered through a service entrance during the morning delivery schedule, when traffic is heaviest and individual identification might be less rigorous." The magnitude of the security failure was becoming clear to James, and he realized that his successful resolution of the immediate crisis might be overshadowed by larger questions about systemic vulnerabilities in palace protection. If Morrison had been able to penetrate royal security using insider knowledge, it raised disturbing questions about how many other former employees might possess similar capabilities. "What was on the cloth he was carrying?" James asked, remembering the chemical-soaked fabric that Morrison had been prepared to use on Charlotte. "Laboratory analysis is still pending," Commander Walsh said, "but preliminary field testing suggests it was chloroform or a similar sedative." Morrison apparently intended to incapacitate Princess Charlotte and remove her from the palace. His vehicle was found in the staff parking area with restraints and additional chemical supplies. James felt his stomach turn as he contemplated what might have happened if he hadn't responded as quickly as he had. The thought of Charlotte being drugged and kidnapped by a mentally unstable individual was almost too horrible to consider, and he felt a renewed surge of gratitude that his instincts had driven him to act without hesitation. "There's something else you need to know," Commander Walsh continued, her expression growing even more serious. During Morrison's initial questioning, he made repeated references to other individuals who allegedly share his concerns about royal security. He claims to be part of a group of former palace employees who believe the family is inadequately protected from specific threats. "Do you think there's any truth to these claims?" James asked, though he suspected he already knew the answer. "Intelligence services are investigating, but initial assessment suggests Morrison's claims are the product of paranoid delusion rather than actual conspiracy. However, we can't afford to take any chances." Security protocols are being reviewed and updated as we speak, and all former employees with access to sensitive areas are being reinvestigated. As Commander Walsh spoke, James began to understand the broader implications of the morning's events. What had started as his personal response to a child's cry for help had exposed significant weaknesses in royal protection and would likely result in major changes to how palace security operated. "Sergeant Mitchell," Commander Walsh said, her tone shifting to something more formal, "I want you to understand that your response this morning was exemplary. You protected Princess Charlotte from serious harm, possibly prevented a kidnapping, and resolved a dangerous situation without loss of life. However, your deviation from protocol cannot be overlooked, regardless of the positive outcome." James had expected this moment and was prepared to accept whatever consequences his actions might bring. "I understand, ma'am. I take full responsibility for abandoning my post and acting without authorization. If my actions warrant disciplinary measures, I'm prepared to accept them." "On the contrary," Commander Walsh replied with a slight smile, "your actions warrant commendation. Yes, you deviated from standard protocol, but you did so in service of the primary mission, protecting the royal family. Sometimes exceptional circumstances require exceptional responses, and this was clearly one of those situations." James felt a wave of relief wash over him, though he remained focused on the larger implications of the security breach. What happens to Morrison now? He'll be charged with attempted kidnapping, trespassing on royal property, and making terroristic threats. Given his mental state, he'll likely undergo psychiatric evaluation and treatment. The goal is to ensure he receives the help he needs while preventing any future threats to the royal family. As their debriefing concluded, James found his thoughts turning to Charlotte and how she might be processing the traumatic experience. Despite her remarkable composure during the crisis, he knew that children often experience delayed reactions to frightening events, and he hoped she would receive appropriate support in the coming days. "One final thing," Commander Walsh said as she prepared to leave the library. "Princess Charlotte specifically requested that you be available to speak with her later today. She apparently wants to thank you personally for your help. I think that conversation might be beneficial for both of you." James nodded, feeling honored by Charlotte's request and hopeful that speaking with her might help both of them process the intense experience they had shared. As he watched Commander Walsh leave the library, he reflected on the strange twists of fate that had brought him to this moment. How a routine morning shift had become a defining moment in his career and possibly in the life of a young princess who would one day serve her country in ways that neither of them could yet imagine. The library, which had been the scene of such terror just hours earlier, now seemed peaceful again, its tall shelves and comfortable chairs restored to their intended purpose as a quiet sanctuary for learning and reflection. But James knew that he would never again be able to enter this room without remembering the moment when everything had hung in the balance, when split-second decisions had determined whether a child would be safe or would disappear into the darkness of a disturbed man's delusions. As he prepared to return to his duties, James felt the weight of responsibility that came with protecting those who could never truly be safe, who lived their lives under constant scrutiny and potential threats simply because of the circumstances of their birth. It was a responsibility he had chosen willingly, but this morning had shown him just how personal and immediate that responsibility could become. The intruder's grip on Princess Charlotte loosened slightly as the sound of approaching footsteps grew louder in the hallway. James recognized this as both an opportunity and a potential catastrophe. The man might panic and do something desperate when he realized how thoroughly surrounded he had become. James needed to act before backup arrived and turned this delicate situation into chaos. "Listen to me very carefully," James said, his voice taking on the calm, authoritative tone he had perfected during hostage negotiation training. "In about 30 seconds, this room is going to be full of armed guards who haven't had the chance to assess the situation the way I have. They're going to see a threat to Princess Charlotte, and their response will be immediate and overwhelming. Your only chance of surviving this is to work with me right now." The man's eyes flickered with uncertainty, and James could see the first cracks forming in his desperate resolve. Charlotte remained perfectly still, her young mind somehow understanding that any sudden movement might trigger violence. James felt a surge of pride at her composure under such terrifying circumstances. Even at 9 years old, she was already displaying the grace under pressure that would serve her well in her future role. "What's your name?" James asked the intruder, slowly lowering his weapon a few degrees while maintaining his readiness to fire if necessary. "Help me understand what brought you here today." "David," the man replied after a moment's hesitation. "David Morrison. And I'm telling you the truth. There are people who want to hurt this family. I have information about a plot, and I needed to get her away from here before they strike." James processed this information rapidly. David Morrison, the name was vaguely familiar, and after a moment, he remembered why. 3 months ago, there had been a security briefing about a former palace maintenance worker who had been terminated for erratic behavior and making strange claims about threats against the royal family. The man had been deemed harmless but unstable, and his access credentials had been revoked. "David, I remember your file," James said carefully. "You used to work here in maintenance. You were concerned about security vulnerabilities, weren't you?" David's face showed surprise that James knew his history, and for the first time since entering the room, some of the wild desperation left his eyes. "You listened to my reports? About the gaps in the perimeter security? About how easy it would be for someone with bad intentions to get inside?" "I remember," James lied smoothly, knowing that building any kind of connection with David was crucial to resolving this peacefully. "But this isn't the way to demonstrate your concerns. You're scaring Princess Charlotte, and you're going to get yourself killed if you don't let her go right now." The footsteps in the hallway had stopped just outside the library door, and James knew that his colleagues were positioning themselves for a coordinated entry. He held up his hand behind his back, hoping they would see the gesture and understand his request for more time before they moved in with force. Charlotte's eyes met James's for a brief moment, and he was struck by the intelligence and trust he saw there. This remarkable child understood that he was trying to help her, and she was doing everything she could to assist by remaining calm and still. James made a mental note to commend her bravery to her parents when this was over. "David, I need you to think about something," James continued, taking another small step forward. "You say you want to protect Princess Charlotte. Look at her right now. Really look at her. Is this what protection looks like? She's terrified. She's in pain from how tightly you're gripping her arm. And she doesn't understand why someone she's never met is treating her this way." David glanced down at Charlotte, and James saw his expression soften slightly as he took in her tear-stained face and trembling form. "I'm sorry," David whispered to her. "I didn't mean to frighten you. I was just trying to help." "I know you were," Charlotte replied in a small but steady voice that amazed James with its composure. "But you're hurting my arm, and I want to go back to my lessons now." The simple, direct honesty of a child's perspective seemed to cut through David's delusions more effectively than any tactical psychological approach. He looked down at his hand gripping her arm and slowly loosened his hold, though he didn't release her completely. James seized this moment of vulnerability and took another step closer, now within arm's reach of both Charlotte and her captor. "David, I'm going to make you a promise. If you let Princess Charlotte go right now, I will personally ensure that your security concerns are reviewed by the appropriate authorities. But you have to trust me and let her go." "They didn't listen before," David said bitterly. "I submitted 17 different reports about vulnerabilities in the security system. I showed them exactly how someone could infiltrate the palace and get close to the family. They called me paranoid and terminated my employment." "Maybe they were wrong," James said, maintaining his calm tone while calculating the precise movements he would need to separate David from Charlotte if negotiation failed. "Maybe your concerns were valid, and they should have listened. But proving your point by terrifying a 9-year-old girl isn't going to make them take you seriously. It's only going to get you arrested or worse." The truth was that James had no memory of any security reports from David Morrison, and he suspected that the man's concerns had been the product of mental instability rather than legitimate observations. But building rapport with an unstable individual sometimes required acknowledging their perspective, even when that perspective was fundamentally flawed. David seemed to wrestle with James's words, his internal struggle visible in the conflicted expressions that crossed his face. The cloth in his hand, which James still suspected contained some kind of sedative, remained a constant threat, but David's grip on it had loosened considerably as their conversation continued. "How do I know you're telling the truth?" David asked. "How do I know you won't just arrest me the moment I let her go?" "Because I'm a man of my word," James replied simply. "And because whether you believe it or not, we both want the same thing, Princess Charlotte's safety. The difference is that I know the best way to keep her safe is to get her away from this situation immediately." From the corner of his eye, James caught a glimpse of movement in the hallway. His backup team was positioning themselves for entry, probably growing impatient with the extended negotiation. James knew he had perhaps another minute before they would decide to take action regardless of his attempts at peaceful resolution. "David, listen to me very carefully," James said, allowing a note of urgency to enter his voice. "In about 60 seconds, that door is going to open and 6 armed guards are going to enter this room. When they see you holding Princess Charlotte, their training will take over, and they will neutralize the threat with whatever force necessary. I'm the only thing standing between you and a very bad ending to this situation." This stark reality seemed to penetrate David's confused thinking more than any previous appeal had managed. His eyes darted between James's face and the library door, and James could see him beginning to grasp the full implications of his situation. "But if there really is a plot against the family," David said desperately, "if there really are people planning to hurt them, letting her go means leaving her vulnerable to the real threats." "Then, help me protect her by giving me the information you have," James replied. "Tell me everything you know about these supposed threats, but do it after you've released her. Show me that you really are trying to help, not hurt." Charlotte, who had been listening to this entire exchange with remarkable composure, chose that moment to speak again. "Please," she said quietly, looking directly at David. "I promise that Sergeant Mitchell will listen to what you have to say, but I need to go back to my lessons now. My governess will be worried about me." The simple, trusting words of a child asking to return to her normal routine seemed to have a profound effect on David. James watched as something fundamental shifted in the man's demeanor, as if Charlotte's innocent request had finally broken through the wall of paranoia and desperation that had driven him to this extreme action. "You promise you'll listen?" David asked James, his voice now carrying more uncertainty than aggression. "I give you my word as a royal guard," James replied solemnly. "Release Princess Charlotte, put the cloth on the ground, and step away from her. Then, we'll talk about your concerns in a way that doesn't put anyone in danger." David looked down at Charlotte one more time, and James saw the exact moment when the man's better nature finally overcame his delusions. With obvious reluctance, he released his grip on her arm and stepped backward, allowing space between himself and the princess. "Charlotte, come to me," James said softly, extending his hand toward her while keeping his weapon trained on David. "Walk slowly, and stay behind me once you get here." The brave little girl moved with careful, measured steps toward James, her composure finally beginning to crack as the immediate danger passed. James felt a surge of protectiveness as she reached his side and positioned herself behind him, her small hand gripping the back of his uniform jacket. "Now the cloth, David," James instructed. "Put it on the ground and kick it away from you." David complied, dropping the cloth and pushing it across the floor with his foot. James made a mental note of its location. The substance on that cloth would need to be analyzed to determine exactly what David had planned to use on Princess Charlotte. With Charlotte safely behind him and the immediate threat neutralized, James allowed himself a moment of relief before addressing the next phase of the situation. He could hear movement in the hallway that suggested his backup team was preparing to enter, and he needed to ensure that the transition from negotiation to arrest went smoothly. "David, I need you to lie face down on the floor with your hands behind your head," James instructed, his voice returning to the authoritative tone of a law enforcement officer. "Do not make any sudden movements. Other guards are about to enter this room, and I need them to see that you're cooperating fully." As David slowly lowered himself to the floor, James activated his radio with his free hand. "This is Sergeant Mitchell. Situation is under control. Princess Charlotte is safe. Suspect is complying. Request medical team to library for evaluation of both princess and suspect." The library door opened moments later, and James's colleagues entered with weapons drawn, quickly surrounding David while he remained prone on the floor. James finally allowed himself to holster his weapon and turn his full attention to Princess Charlotte, who was now openly crying as the adrenaline of her ordeal began to wear off. "You're safe now," he told her gently, kneeling down to her eye level. "You were incredibly brave, and I'm very proud of how well you handled that scary situation. Is he really going to hurt my family?" Charlotte asked through her tears, and James felt his heart ache at the fear in her young voice. "No," James replied firmly. "He's confused and scared, but he's not going to hurt anyone. My job is to make sure you and your family stay safe, and I take that job very seriously." As the other guards secured David and began the process of removing him from the library, James stayed with Charlotte, offering what comfort he could while they waited for the medical team to arrive. He knew that this incident would trigger a massive review of palace security procedures, and that every detail of his response would be scrutinized by his superiors. But in that moment, with Princess Charlotte safe beside him and the immediate crisis resolved, James felt the quiet satisfaction of knowing he had done exactly what he had sworn to do: protect a member of the royal family from harm, regardless of the personal cost or professional consequences. The morning mist clung to the ancient stones of Kensington Palace like a protective shroud, concealing the bustling activity that had already begun within its walls. Sergeant James Mitchell adjusted his crimson uniform one final time, the familiar weight of his ceremonial sword a comforting presence at his side. At 34 years old, he had served the royal family for over a decade, his weathered face bearing the quiet confidence of a man who had dedicated his life to protecting the crown. The golden rays of dawn filtered through the tall windows of the East Wing, casting long shadows across the polished marble floors where James now stood at attention. His position today was what the other guards called the Princess Post, a coveted assignment that meant watching over the private quarters where 9-year-old Princess Charlotte spent her mornings before her daily lessons began. It was considered one of the more peaceful duties, far removed from the chaos of public engagements and state functions. James had always taken pride in his ability to remain invisible yet vigilant, a sentinel whose presence was felt but never intrusive. The royal children had grown accustomed to seeing him during their daily routines, and Princess Charlotte, with her bright smile and curious nature, often greeted him with a cheerful wave as she hurried past to her tutoring sessions. The palace corridors were unusually quiet this Tuesday morning. The Duke and Duchess of Cambridge had departed early for a charity engagement in Scotland, leaving the children in the care of their trusted nanny, Maria Santos, and the ever-present security detail. James could hear the distant sounds of the kitchen staff preparing breakfast, the soft murmur of voices echoing from the servants' quarters, and the gentle tick of the grandfather clock that had marked time in these halls for over 2 centuries. As he stood guard, James reflected on the conversation he'd had with his wife, Sarah, the previous evening. She had expressed her usual concern about his work, the way it consumed his thoughts even during his time off, the way he would wake in the middle of the night, alert and ready for threats that existed only in his vigilant mind. But James couldn't explain to her what she might never understand: that protecting the royal family wasn't just his job, it was his calling, woven into the very fabric of his being. The sound of small feet pattering down the hallway interrupted his thoughts. Princess Charlotte appeared around the corner, her school uniform slightly askew, her backpack slung over one shoulder. She was running late for her French lesson, as had become her habit lately. James suppressed a small smile as she rushed past, her governess trailing behind with an exasperated expression. "Good morning, Sergeant Mitchell," Charlotte called over her shoulder, not breaking her stride. "Good morning, Your Royal Highness," James replied formally, though his eyes followed her progress down the hall with the protective instinct that had been honed through years of service. The next hour passed in the familiar rhythm of palace life. James monitored the comings and goings of staff members, his trained eyes automatically cataloging each face, each movement, each deviation from the normal pattern. Security protocol required him to memorize the daily schedule of everyone who might legitimately be in this section of the palace, and Over the years, he had developed an almost supernatural ability to spot anything out of place. At precisely 10:30 a.m., as the ancient clock chimed the half hour, James heard the sound that would haunt his dreams and define his legacy, a child's scream, high and desperate, cutting through the morning calm like a blade. It was Princess Charlotte's voice, unmistakable in its terror, calling for help from somewhere deeper in the palace. Without hesitation, James abandoned his post and ran toward the sound, his heavy boots thundering against the marble floors. Training kicked in automatically. His hand moved to his radio to call for backup, even as his legs carried him through corridors he knew by heart. The scream came again, more frantic this time, and James felt his heart rate spike as he calculated distances and possible threats. He rounded the corner to the library wing, where Charlotte often went to read between lessons, and saw the heavy oak door slightly ajar. Through the gap, he could hear voices, Charlotte's frightened whimpers, and a man's voice, low and urgent. James's blood ran cold as he realized this was not a member of the regular staff. Drawing his weapon in one fluid motion, James approached the door with the silent precision that had been drilled into him during countless training exercises. Through the crack in the door, he could see Princess Charlotte backed against the tall bookshelves, tears streaming down her face, while a man in maintenance coveralls advanced toward her. The intruder's back was to the door, but James could see he was holding something in his hand, a cloth that he seemed intent on using to silence the frightened child. Time slowed to a crawl as James assessed the situation. The man was approximately 6 feet tall, medium build, dark hair. His coveralls bore the logo of a legitimate maintenance company that did work throughout the palace, but something about his posture, his aggressive approach toward Charlotte, set off every alarm in James's experienced mind. This was not routine maintenance work. James knew he had seconds to act before the situation escalated beyond recovery. Charlotte's safety was paramount, but he also had to consider the possibility that this man might be armed with more than just the cloth he was currently wielding. The narrow confines of the library, with its towering shelves and limited escape routes, created a tactical nightmare. Making the split-second decision that would define his career, James burst through the door with controlled violence, his weapon trained on the intruder. "Step away from the princess. Now," he commanded, his voice carrying the full authority of his position and years of experience dealing with potential threats. The man spun around, startled by the sudden intrusion, and James got his first clear look at the face, mid-30s, unkempt beard, eyes that held a wild desperation that immediately confirmed James's worst fears. This was not a confused maintenance worker or a lost tourist. This was someone who had deliberately gained access to the palace with malicious intent toward a child. "I said step away," James repeated, moving into the room with the fluid precision of a predator stalking its prey. His finger rested lightly on the trigger, ready to fire if necessary, but his primary focus was on creating distance between the threat and Princess Charlotte. Charlotte, seeing her protector arrive, sobbed with relief and tried to move toward James, but the intruder grabbed her arm, pulling her closer to him as a human shield. James felt his blood pressure spike as the situation rapidly deteriorated into exactly the scenario he had trained for but hoped never to face: a direct threat to a royal child's life. "Let her go," James said, his voice steady despite the adrenaline coursing through his veins. "There's nowhere for you to run. This building is surrounded by armed guards who will be here any moment. Your only chance of walking away from this is to release the princess right now." The man's eyes darted around the room, looking for escape routes that didn't exist. James could see the wild calculation in his expression, the desperate mathematics of a cornered criminal weighing his rapidly dwindling options. The cloth in his hand, which James now realized was likely soaked with some kind of chemical, trembled as the man's grip tightened on Charlotte's arm. "You don't understand," the intruder said, his voice carrying a strange mixture of desperation and conviction. "She needs to come with me. There are people who want to hurt her family, and I'm trying to protect her. I'm trying to save her." James had encountered enough unstable individuals during his career to recognize the particular brand of delusion he was dealing with. This man genuinely believed he was acting in Charlotte's best interest, which made him even more dangerous because he wouldn't be easily reasoned with using conventional logic. "I understand you think you're helping," James said carefully, maintaining his weapon's aim while slowly advancing another step closer. "But look at her face. She's terrified. You're hurting her right now. Whatever information you think you have, whatever threat you believe exists, this isn't the way to handle it." Charlotte whimpered softly, and James felt his heart break at the sound. This child, who should be worried about nothing more serious than her upcoming French exam, was being traumatized by a situation that would likely affect her for years to come. The protective instinct that drove James in his work crystallized into a cold, focused determination to end this threat immediately. The intruder seemed to sense James's increasing resolve and tightened his grip on Charlotte, causing her to cry out in pain. That sound, the distressed cry of the child he had sworn to protect, triggered something primal in James's response system. His training, his instincts, and his human compassion all aligned in perfect focus on a single objective: neutralize the threat and save Princess Charlotte. "Last warning," James said, his voice dropping to a deadly quiet tone that left no room for misinterpretation. "Release her now, or I will use whatever force necessary to ensure her safety." The standoff stretched for what felt like hours, but was actually only seconds. James could hear footsteps in the hallway outside, backup finally arriving. But he knew that the situation would likely be resolved one way or another before they could reach the library. Everything now depended on his ability to read the intruder's intentions and respond appropriately. In that crystalline moment of suspended time, with his weapon trained on a desperate man holding a frightened child, Sergeant James Mitchell embodied everything that the Royal Guard represented: unwavering loyalty, split-second decision-making under pressure, and the absolute willingness to sacrifice everything to protect those placed under his care. The next few seconds would determine not only Princess Charlotte's fate, but also whether James would be remembered as the guard who saved a royal child or the one who failed in the moment that mattered most. In the grand halls of Kensington Palace, where protocol reigns supreme and every whisper echoes through centuries of tradition, sometimes the most extraordinary acts of courage happen in the space of a single heartbeat. What would you do if you heard a child's desperate cry for help pierce through the marble corridors of power? For Royal Guard Sergeant James Mitchell, that split-second decision would not only save a young princess, but forever change the very foundations of royal security. This is the true story of how one man's lightning-fast reflexes and unwavering dedication turned an ordinary Tuesday morning into a moment that would be whispered about in royal circles for generations to come.